It was a cold December morning in 1990, the kind of day where the air bites at your exposed skin and the promise of snow hangs heavy in the clouds. Frank Miller, a 48-year-old truck driver, was on the road, a routine trip he had made countless times before. He was headed south from his home in small-town Montana, his destination the bustling city of Butte. His truck, a maroon Peterbilt, was his livelihood and his second home. It was also, on this particular day, his tomb. The last anyone saw of Frank Miller was a fleeting image captured by a security camera at a truck stop just outside of town. A grainy black-and-white ghost of a man and his machine disappearing into the vast, unforgiving landscape. And then, there was nothing. Frank simply vanished. The silence that followed was more deafening than any scream. His family, his wife, and two grown children waited. They waited for a phone call, a postcard, a sign that he was safe, but the phone remained silent and no letter ever arrived. The authorities were notified and the initial search began with a familiar, weary rhythm. They checked the usual places: rest stops, truck depots, the sprawling network of diners and motels that peppered the highways. They put out bulletins to other truckers, to police departments in neighboring states. The search was wide, but it was also shallow. Frank Miller, a man of routine and habit, had broken his pattern and strayed from the known path, and in doing so, he had dissolved into the ether. It was a cold case almost from the moment it began, a file tucked away in a dusty cabinet, a photograph on a missing persons poster that slowly faded under the relentless sun. The years passed. The snows of countless Montana winters buried the memory of that day, only for the spring thaw to reveal nothing new. Frank's children grew older. His wife became a widow without a body to mourn. The mystery of his disappearance became a part of the family's narrative, a gaping wound that never quite healed. They learned to live with the not knowing, but the uncertainty was a constant low-level thrum of pain, a phantom ache. They held on to the hope, however thin, that one day he would simply walk back into their lives, a forgotten memory of a simpler time. But deep down they knew the truth. The wilderness of Montana is a hungry place. It swallows secrets whole and holds them for eternity. The vast open spaces are deceptive. They can conceal a man, a truck, a life without a trace. The authorities, after exhausting every lead, came to the grim conclusion that Frank had likely had a fatal accident, and his truck had gone off-road into a remote canyon or a deep ravine, a place so inaccessible that it would never be found. The case was officially closed, marked as a presumed fatality. For the family, the closure was a hollow, empty word. There was no funeral, no grave to visit, just the silence and the endless questions that haunted their days and their dreams. The memory of Frank Miller, a hard-working man with a quiet smile, began to blur, a photograph left out in the sun for too long. His children grew up, had families of their own, but the ghost of their father's disappearance was a constant presence, a lingering shadow in their lives. The case lay dormant for 25 years, a quarter of a century of silence. The world moved on. Technology advanced. New generations of investigators came of age. But the cold case file of Frank Miller remained undisturbed, a relic of a time before cell phones and GPS trackers. The maroon Peterbilt became a whisper, a local legend, a ghost story told around campfires. Some said he had simply driven away to start a new life. Others whispered of foul play. The truth, as it so often does, was stranger and more chilling than any fiction. The story would not be found on a dusty road or in a remote forest, but at the bottom of a lake. The breakthrough came not from a new piece of evidence or a sudden confession, but from a group of underwater divers. They were not law enforcement, but hobbyists, a collective of amateur sleuths and explorers who dedicated their weekends to a macabre mission. searching for submerged vehicles in the nation's lakes and rivers. They were armed with high-tech sonar equipment and an insatiable curiosity. On a crisp October day in 2015, they were exploring the depths of Lake Francis, a sprawling body of water nestled in the heart of Montana, a few dozen miles from Frank Miller's last known location. The lake was known for its dark, murky waters and its deceptively deep pockets. They had dropped their sonar into the icy water, the screen on their boat showing a digital map of the lake bed, a ghostly landscape of sediment and submerged logs. The rhythmic ping of the sonar was the only sound, a stark contrast to the quiet of the wilderness that surrounded them. And then, a shape appeared on the screen. A large rectangular mass unlike anything they had seen before. It was too regular to be a natural rock formation, too large to be a downed tree. The divers exchanged a look, their casual curiosity giving way to a more focused, intense interest. They carefully maneuvered their boat, circling the anomaly, getting a clearer reading. The shape was distinct, with sharp angles and a long, tapering body. It was unmistakable. It was a truck. A sense of gravity settled over the small boat. They had found a vehicle, but what kind? And more importantly, who was inside? They prepared their gear, the familiar ritual of checking tanks and masks now imbued with a new, somber purpose. They descended into the cold, silent depths, the light from their headlamps cutting through the gloom like a knife. The water was frigid, the visibility low, and the pressure on their ears was a constant reminder of how far they had descended. And then the truck materialized from the shadows, a grotesque and beautiful sight. It was a Peterbilt, its maroon paint now a dull, rusted brown, encrusted with a quarter-century of algae and sediment. The tires were still inflated, the chrome grille still mostly intact, but the front windshield was shattered, a gaping hole in the face of the machine. The divers circled the vehicle, their lights illuminating the macabre details. A single dark shape was visible through the driver's side window. It was a skeleton, still seated in the driver's seat, its bony hands still gripping the steering wheel. The divers, hardened by years of similar searches, felt a profound sense of awe and horror. This wasn't just a car accident. This was a time capsule, a chilling tableau frozen in time. They surfaced, their report to the authorities a calm, professional recitation of the facts. But their voices held an unmistakable tremor. The local police, initially skeptical, quickly dispatched a team to the site. The discovery of the truck, later identified as Frank Miller's, was a bombshell. The cold case file, now yellowed and fragile, was dusted off and reopened. The family was notified, the news delivered with a quiet, somber professionalism. For Frank Miller's children, the news was a jolt, a sudden and violent end to the long, low hum of uncertainty. The hope they had held on to for so long, the faint flicker of possibility that he was still alive, was extinguished. The pain of the past was now a fresh, raw wound, but it was also a form of release. They finally had an answer. Their father was not a runaway or a ghost. He had been there all along in the quiet, watery depths waiting to be found. But the discovery of the truck and Frank's remains was only the first chapter of a new story. The investigation, now a joint effort between the local sheriff's office and a specialized forensic dive team, began in earnest. The divers, now working with law enforcement, carefully documented every detail. They meticulously photographed the scene, their cameras capturing the ghostly outlines of the truck and the silent sentinel within. The recovery operation was a delicate, painstaking process. They attached large, inflatable lift bags to the chassis, slowly and carefully raising the massive vehicle from its resting place. The truck, caked in mud and lake debris, emerged from the water like a monstrous sea creature, a rusted leviathan pulled from the abyss. The sight of it was a surreal and poignant moment, a ghost from the past now brought into the light of day. The authorities now had a new line of inquiry. Why was Frank's truck in the lake? The initial assumption was that he had simply lost control, a tragic accident on a dark, rainy night. But the forensic examination of the truck, now sitting on a flatbed at the police impound lot, would reveal a truth that would shatter this assumption and plunge the case into a new, more sinister light. The forensic team began their meticulous examination of the recovered Peterbilt. They peeled back layers of rust and sediment, searching for clues for the story the truck itself could tell. The first thing they noticed was the state of the vehicle. The engine was in gear, suggesting the truck was in motion at the time it entered the water. The brakes were not engaged. This supported the theory of an accidental plunge. But then, a closer look at the steering column revealed a disturbing detail. The key was not in the ignition. It was found on the floorboard of the cab, partially hidden under a mat, as if it had been deliberately removed and tossed aside. This was a crucial first piece of evidence that began to unravel the simple accident theory. Why would a driver remove the key while the truck was in motion? It made no sense. This small detail, so easily missed, was a glaring red flag, a quiet scream from the past. The interior of the cab was a somber archaeological site. They found a thermos, a pack of cigarettes, and a small worn photograph of a woman and 2 children. Frank's wife and his kids, a portrait of the life he was trying to get home to. But they also found something else, something that didn't belong. A small rusted arrowhead of a type common to the region's indigenous tribes was wedged into the driver's side seat cushion. It was a strange, anachronistic artifact to find in a modern truck. It had no obvious connection to Frank Miller. Was it a trinket, a souvenir, or was it a calling card? The discovery of the arrowhead, combined with the missing key, pushed the investigation in a new direction. The focus shifted from a tragic accident to a potential crime. But a crime committed by whom and why? There were no signs of a struggle in the cab, no bullet holes, no shattered glass that could not be explained by the impact with the water. The body of Frank Miller was also subjected to a forensic examination, a grim and delicate process. The bones, protected by the cold water and the slow passage of time, were remarkably well preserved. The medical examiner found no evidence of a struggle, no broken bones or stab wounds. The cause of death was officially ruled as drowning, which was consistent with a submerged vehicle. But the lack of external trauma didn't mean there was no foul play. The team now considered a different scenario. What if Frank Miller had been incapacitated before his truck went into the water? What if he was drugged or rendered unconscious in some other way? The medical examiner's report offered a chilling clue. The bone samples contained traces of a substance, a common sedative that was often used to put people to sleep before medical procedures. It was a quiet, insidious poison, a silent weapon. The sedative would have rendered Frank Miller defenseless, allowing someone to take control of his truck, to drive it deliberately into the lake, to make his death look like a tragic accident. The narrative was now completely different. The tragic accident was a carefully staged murder. The missing key, the arrowhead, the sedative in his system. Each piece of evidence was a puzzle piece that, when fitted together, revealed a horrific picture of premeditation and malice. The question was no longer what happened to Frank Miller, but who did this to him and why. The investigation now became a murder inquiry. A 25-year-old cold case transformed into a fresh and urgent hunt for a killer. The investigators, now with the benefit of modern technology, began to re-interview the original witnesses, the truck stop employees, the family, anyone who might have had contact with Frank in the final days of his life. They sifted through old police reports, looking for new connections, for names that might have been overlooked in the initial investigation. The discovery of the arrowhead was a major new lead. It suggested a connection to the local indigenous community, but it was a flimsy, tenuous link. They spoke with local tribal historians and cultural experts, learning that the arrowhead was a type used for hunting, not warfare. It was a practical tool, not a symbolic weapon. But it was still a key piece of the puzzle, a breadcrumb trail left by a killer who may have been sending a message. The investigators now had a new line of questioning for the old witnesses. Did Frank Miller have any known enemies? Was he involved in any disputes? Was there anything strange or unusual about his life in the weeks leading up to his disappearance? The emotional tone in the community shifted from a quiet, mournful resignation to a tense and fearful speculation. A killer had walked among them for a quarter of a century, their horrific crime buried in the depths of a lake, a ghost in plain sight. The case of Frank Miller was no longer a sad mystery. It was a ghost story with a living monster at its heart, and the clock was ticking to unmask them before they could fade back into the shadows. The cold case, now burning hot, was a race against time and the fading memories of a generation. The truth was there in the silence of the lake and the quiet whispers of a long-ago crime, waiting for someone to listen. The focus of the investigation now turned inward, toward Frank Miller's inner circle. The first line of inquiry for any murder case is always the family, but the initial investigation had long since cleared them of suspicion. Now, with the new evidence, they had to be re-examined. Frank's wife, now a gray-haired woman of 70, and his 2 children, now middle-aged, were brought in for questioning. The process was a heartbreaking one, reopening wounds that had been carefully stitched shut for decades. They were asked about Frank's relationships, his finances, his habits. Did he have any secrets? Any hidden life? They all insisted he was a simple, honest man, a devoted husband and father. He worked. He came home. He went on trips. He called his wife every night. But the investigators pressed. They asked about the day of his disappearance. Did he seem different? Was he anxious or stressed? His wife recalled a small, seemingly insignificant detail. Frank had been unusually quiet that morning. He had seemed preoccupied, as if something was weighing on his mind. When she had asked him what was wrong, he had simply said, "Nothing, honey. Just a long day ahead." It was a mundane exchange, but in the context of what happened, it took on a chilling new meaning. It was the last time she would ever speak to him. The investigators also looked at his finances. Frank Miller was a hard-working man, but he was not wealthy. His bank accounts were modest, and there was nothing to suggest a sudden windfall or a significant debt. There was no financial motive. The motive, if there was one, had to be personal, rooted in a conflict or a betrayal that had been buried along with his truck. The investigators then turned their attention to Frank's professional life, his network of friends and acquaintances in the trucking industry. The old police reports contained a list of names, fellow drivers, truck stop owners, mechanics. The investigators painstakingly tracked them down, most now older, some retired, and some deceased. They asked about Frank, about his personality, his relationships with others. The stories were all the same. Frank was well-liked, a good-natured guy who kept to himself. He wasn't one for drama. He wasn't one to make enemies. This made the case even more puzzling. If it was a murder, it was a deeply personal one, a crime of quiet hatred, not a public one of rage or greed. The investigation was at a standstill, a new body of evidence with no clear path to a suspect. The case of the arrowhead was a new avenue, but it led to a dead end. The local tribes had no records of a Frank Miller, no known conflicts with anyone in the community. The artifact was a cruel joke, a piece of misdirection, or a clue so subtle they were missing its true meaning. But then, a retired police officer who had worked the original case came forward with a new piece of information. He had been a young detective at the time and had a clear, vivid memory of one of the interviews. He remembered a detail that had seemed insignificant at the time, a detail that had been left out of the official report. He had spoken with a young mechanic at a truck stop a few miles from where Frank was last seen. The mechanic, a young man named Tom, had been working on Frank's truck the day before he disappeared. He had a reputation for being a bit of a hothead, and he had gotten into an argument with Frank over the price of the repair. It was a minor dispute, but the retired detective remembered the animosity in Tom's voice. He had told the investigators, "Frank's a cheap bastard." He got what was coming to him. At the time, it had seemed like a flippant, angry remark. Now it had a different, more chilling ring to it. The police tracked down Tom, now a man in his late 50s, living a quiet life in a different state. He was a family man, with a respected job, a seemingly upstanding member of his community. When the investigators showed up at his door, he was cooperative, but his eyes held a flicker of something, a nervous energy that he tried to hide. He remembered Frank Miller, the truck, the argument. He admitted that he had been angry about the money, but he denied any involvement in Frank's disappearance. He had an alibi, a detailed account of his whereabouts on the day in question, corroborated by his wife and a handful of other people. But the investigators had a new tool, one that didn't exist in 1990, forensic psychology. They brought in an expert, a specialist in cold case interrogations. The expert studied Tom's responses, his body language, the subtle tells that betray a lie. The expert noted a pattern of avoidance, a tendency to answer questions with questions, a classic sign of someone who is hiding something. They presented him with the new evidence, the key on the floorboard, the sedative, the arrowhead. The mention of the arrowhead in particular caused a visible tremor in Tom's hands. It was the key. It was the moment the old detective's memory came to life. They now had a suspect. The case was no longer a mystery, but a hunt for a confession. The silent truth buried for a quarter of a century was now poised to erupt. The final pieces of the puzzle were now in place. The investigation was not about finding new evidence, but about forcing a confession. The emotional tone was no longer about dread, but about justice. The final act was about to begin, and the long, quiet wait for answers was about to end in a crescendo of truth and consequence. The investigators, now armed with a powerful new lead, returned to the old mechanic, Tom. They didn't show up with a warrant or a team of officers. They came with a quiet, persistent presence, a relentless narrative that eroded his carefully constructed wall of lies. They sat with him in a sterile, impersonal interview room, the air thick with unspoken truths. They laid out the facts not as accusations, but as a story. A story about a man named Frank Miller who had gone missing, a man they had now found, a man who had not died by accident but by design. They spoke of the sedative, of the key, of the arrowhead. The arrowhead was the turning point. Tom's face, which had been a mask of studied calm, began to crack. He had known with an unnerving certainty that the arrowhead would never be found. It was a piece of him, a symbol of his rage and his connection to the wilderness where he thought he had buried his secret forever. The investigators watched as his composure unraveled. They knew he had grown up on a family farm on the edge of a tribal reservation. They knew the arrowhead was a relic of his childhood, a piece of a past he had tried to bury. He had used it as a taunt, a symbol of his supposed superiority and his knowledge of the land. A final, cruel flourish to an act of cold-blooded murder. The story that emerged was one of a petty argument and a lethal overreaction. Tom had been frustrated by Frank's refusal to pay the full price for the truck repair. He saw Frank not just as a cheap customer, but as a symbol of everything he resented. The hard-working, successful man who was in control of his own life. A life Tom felt was beyond his grasp. The argument had escalated, and Tom, in a fit of impulsive rage, had drugged Frank's coffee with a sedative he had stolen from his uncle, a veterinarian. He had watched as Frank slumped into unconsciousness in the truck stop parking lot, his body betraying him. He had then, in a moment of chilling clarity, decided to make the crime look like a tragic accident. He had driven the truck to the lake, a place he knew well from his youth, a place he knew was deep and treacherous. He had taken the key from the ignition, thrown it on the floor, and in a final hateful act, he had left the arrowhead in the seat as a twisted signature. He had then pushed the truck into the water and watched it sink, the dark water swallowing the last vestige of his crime. He had walked away, the silent woods his witness, and gone on to live a normal, quiet life, the weight of a man's death a burden he carried alone for 25 years. The confession, when it finally came, was a torrent of pent-up guilt and fear. A story told in fits and starts, each detail a new and horrifying revelation. He spoke of the long silent nights, the moments when he thought he heard Frank's truck, the years he had lived in the shadow of his own terrible secret. The investigators listened, their faces impassive, as a man who had lived a lie for a quarter of a century finally told the truth. The story of Frank Miller's disappearance was no longer a mystery. It was a tragedy, a story of a quiet man's life taken by a moment of rage and a simple, easily obtained drug. The discovery in the lake had not just found a body, it had found a killer, a living ghost of a long-ago crime. The silence of the lake had been a lie, a thin veil over a horrifying act. The case was now a matter of public record. Tom was arrested and charged with murder. The news spread through the small community like a brush fire, the shock and disbelief palpable. The man they had known as a good neighbor and a quiet, hard-working family man was a killer. For Frank Miller's family, the arrest was a moment of profound, complicated relief. They had closure, but the truth was more painful than the mystery. The man they had mourned as a victim of a tragic accident was a victim of a terrible injustice. The long, silent vigil was over, but the grief was now tinged with a new, bitter anger. Frank Miller, a man of simple habits and a quiet life, had been killed over a few dollars, his body and his memory buried in a watery grave. The story of his life was a reminder of how quickly and completely a person can disappear, and how the past, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of rising to the surface, a chilling echo from the depths. The quiet of the lake, once a symbol of the great indifferent wilderness, was now a monument to a terrible crime, a silent witness to a truth that had been waiting for a quarter of a century to be told. The water, so cold and dark, had held its secret, but it could not hold back the tide of justice. The story of Frank Miller was not just about a missing person. It was a testament to the unyielding power of truth, a narrative that had been waiting for its final somber act. The trial was a somber and public affair, a stark contrast to the quiet, private mystery that had surrounded Frank Miller's disappearance for a quarter century. The small-town courtroom was packed, filled with curious onlookers and old-timers who remembered the grainy black-and-white photos of the missing trucker. The prosecution laid out its case with a chilling precision, piece by piece, from the discovery of the truck to the forensic analysis of the remains and the meticulous reconstruction of the crime. The defense, caught off guard by the sheer weight of the evidence, was left with a difficult task. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the arrowhead was an incidental find, that the sedative could have been ingested from any number of sources, and that the key could have been dislodged by the impact of the crash. But the prosecution had a powerful weapon: Tom's confession. Though he had since recanted, claiming he was coerced and confused, the recording of his initial confession, a raw and emotional account of the murder, was played for the jury. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence as they listened to his voice, a man wrestling with a truth that had haunted him for half his life. The detail about the arrowhead was the nail in the coffin. It was a piece of information only the killer could have known, a detail that had been carefully withheld from the public and even from the victim's family. The jury, after a short deliberation, returned a verdict of guilty. Tom was sentenced to life in prison, the final act in a tragedy that had spanned decades. For Frank Miller's family, the verdict brought a complex mixture of emotions. There was a sense of justice, a feeling that a terrible wrong had been righted. But there was also a profound sense of loss, a renewed grief for the life that had been so cruelly taken. The mystery was gone, but the pain remained. Frank Miller's story was now a permanent part of the community's history, a cautionary tale about the dark secrets that can lurk beneath the surface of a quiet life. The maroon Peterbilt, now a rusted hulk of a machine, was a monument to his memory, a silent testament to the enduring power of forensic science and the relentless dedication of a few amateur sleuths. The case also brought a measure of comfort to other families with missing loved ones. The story of Frank Miller became a source of hope, a reminder that even the coldest cases can be solved, that the wilderness and the silent depths of a lake cannot hold a secret forever. The true crime community, the amateur investigators and divers who had found the truck in the first place, found themselves at the center of a national story. Their quiet hobby, their patient work, had not only solved a case, but had also brought a killer to justice. They had given a voice to a man who had been silent for 25 years. The end of the story, however, was not about the killer or the investigators, but about the victim. Frank Miller, the man who vanished, was finally found. He was not a ghost or a legend, but a man who had lived and loved, a man who had simply been trying to get home. His story, once a whisper, was now a testament, a stark and powerful reminder of the darkness that can exist in the world and the light that can eventually, against all odds, find its way in. The case of Frank Miller became a touchstone, a powerful example of how memory and truth, like a submerged object, can be drawn from the depths and brought into the light. The cold case file, now a testament to a life and a death, was finally closed, its last chapter written in a courtroom, not in a field or a forest. The silence of the wilderness had been broken, and the voice of the lake, once a silent keeper of a dark secret, was now a chorus of truth and justice, a final, somber note in a long and heartbreaking song. The story of Frank Miller's final journey, from a routine drive to a watery grave and back to the light of day, was a powerful and haunting narrative of loss, persistence, and the undeniable truth that some mysteries, no matter how old, refuse to stay buried. The emotional and psychological aftershocks of the Frank Miller case rippled through the community for years. The memory of the trial, the chilling details of the confession, and the image of the rusted truck being pulled from the lake became a part of the town's collective consciousness. For Frank's family, the closure was a long and arduous process. The discovery of the truth had opened up a new chapter of grief, the anger and betrayal that came with the knowledge that their loved one had been taken from them not by a tragic accident but by a malicious act. They found some solace in the finality of the court's decision, but the feeling of what could have been, what they had lost, was a constant companion. The fact that the killer, a man they had likely never met, had walked among them for so long was a deeply unsettling thought. It shattered the illusion of a safe, predictable world, replacing it with a quiet, persistent sense of unease. The case became a lesson in the fragility of life and the dark depths of human nature. The maroon Peterbilt, the silent witness to the crime, was eventually scrapped, its parts salvaged or sold for a grim sort of curiosity. But the image of it, covered in mud and rust, emerging from the dark water, remained an indelible image in the minds of those who had seen it. It was a tangible link to a past they had all tried to forget. The story also had a lasting impact on law enforcement. The Miller case became a textbook example of the power of forensic technology and interagency cooperation. It demonstrated that a case was never truly cold as long as the evidence was there, waiting for the right tools and the right people to find it. The use of specialized dive teams and modern sonar technology became standard practice in similar cases, a direct legacy of Frank Miller's disappearance and discovery. The amateur divers, the heroes of the story, went on to form a non-profit organization dedicated to helping families find missing vehicles and loved ones. They were no longer hobbyists. They were a lifeline for others who were living through the same uncertainty and pain that Frank Miller's family had endured for so long. The arrowhead, the small, seemingly insignificant object that had unlocked the entire case, was held as evidence, a reminder of the quiet cruelty of the crime. Its simple, ancient form was a stark contrast to the modern-day tragedy it had helped to solve. It was a link to a past that had been twisted for a cruel contemporary purpose. In the end, Frank Miller's story was not just a true crime narrative, it was a powerful testament to the human capacity for resilience, for the long, hard road of finding truth and justice. It was a story about the quiet courage of a family that never gave up hope, a group of dedicated volunteers who refused to let a mystery lie, and a team of investigators who were willing to look at a cold case with fresh eyes. The final chapter of Frank Miller's life was not written by a killer in a moment of anger, but by a community that refused to let his story be forgotten. The sun still sets over Lake Francis, its waters now holding not just a mystery but a memory. A memory of a hard-working man, a rusted truck, and a truth that, against all odds, was pulled from the depths. The quiet whispers of the wilderness now tell a different story. A story of a long-awaited justice. A story that began with a disappearance and ended with a discovery that changed everything. The silence of the lake, once so sinister, was now a somber, sacred place. A final resting place for a man who had been taken too soon. A place where a family could finally mourn in peace. Their long wait for answers finally over.